The story begins in the comfortable homes of Britain in December 1962. Citizens go about their daily lives with little concern for what lies ahead. Snow begins to fall gently, and weather forecasters issue warnings about an approaching cold front. The news reports reach newspapers and radio broadcasts, but most people dismiss the warnings as routine seasonal predictions. Meteorologists observe unusual atmospheric patterns forming over the Atlantic, patterns that rarely occur and that suggest something unprecedented is approaching. Families continue their normal routines, shopping for Christmas presents, decorating their homes, preparing for the holidays. No one truly understands that they are about to experience something that will define their generation and become embedded in the national memory forever. By mid-December, the temperature begins to drop more rapidly than expected. Factory workers notice their breath forming visible clouds inside heated buildings. Shop owners start receiving extra orders from anxious customers who have listened to the weather warnings. Supply deliveries continue normally, but there is a sense of urgency in the air. Elderly residents remember winters from their youth and sense that something unusual is developing. Shop shelves gradually begin to show gaps where extra supplies have been purchased. Coal merchants report increased demand. Heating oil distributors work overtime to fulfill orders before the worst of the weather arrives. The BBC begins issuing more frequent weather bulletins. The Ministry of Health advises families to stockpile essential supplies. Newspapers publish headlines warning of a potential severe winter. The radio broadcasts repeated advisories about preparing homes and ensuring heating systems are functional. Across the nation, people begin taking the warnings more seriously. Pensioners remember stories their parents told about harsh winters from generations past. Young families for the first time feel genuine concern about whether their homes will be warm enough for their children. The comfortable assumptions of modern life, that homes will always be warm, that shops will always be stocked, that services will always function, begin to seem fragile. By the end of December, the first signs of the winter's true nature become apparent. Temperatures drop below freezing and remain there. The snow does not melt as it normally would. Ice begins to accumulate on roads and pavements. The first reports come in of traffic accidents on frozen roads. Transportation becomes more difficult. People who have not yet purchased supplies begin to feel the first stirrings of anxiety. Those who prepared feel temporarily reassured, but their reassurance is premature. January arrives with unprecedented cold. The temperature plummets far below normal seasonal levels. Water pipes begin to freeze in homes across the country. The first families to experience frozen pipes scramble to find solutions. Some wrap pipes in blankets. Others attempt to heat their pipes with whatever fuel they can spare. Phone lines freeze and stop working. Communication across regions becomes impossible. Roads become completely impassable. The first vehicles are abandoned on highways and city streets, buried under rapidly accumulating snow. The national transportation system begins to collapse. Trains cannot run on frozen tracks. Buses slip and slide on icy roads. Lorries carrying supplies become stranded. Supply chains that normally function smoothly begin to break down. Food shipments do not arrive at shops. Coal deliveries stop. Heating oil cannot be transported. The nation's infrastructure, designed for normal conditions, proves inadequate for this extreme weather. Shops begin to show empty shelves for the first time. The initial panic buying depletes stocks, and nothing arrives to replace them. Shopkeepers must ration supplies. Customers who arrive to find empty shelves for essential items experience genuine alarm. Mothers worry about finding milk for their babies. The elderly worry about finding enough food. Working families calculate how long their stores will last if no new supplies arrive. Homes grow colder as heating fuel runs out. Families begin burning furniture, books, and whatever materials they can find to keep fires burning. The living conditions become increasingly primitive despite being in the middle of the 20th century. Families huddle together in single rooms around fires, trying to conserve heat. Children wear multiple layers of clothing even inside their homes. The elderly suffer most acutely from the cold, their aging bodies struggling to maintain body heat. First reports of deaths from exposure and hypothermia begin to appear in local news reports. By mid-February, the crisis reaches its peak. The frost has now lasted over 6 weeks with no sign of ending. Temperatures continue to drop. Snow continues to fall. Ice accumulates to dangerous heights. The nation's infrastructure, already straining, begins to fail completely. Electricity generation becomes problematic as coal-fired power stations struggle to function in the extreme cold. Rolling blackouts are implemented. Hospitals lose power intermittently. Water systems freeze solid in many regions. Large areas lose access to clean water entirely. Hospitals overflow with patients suffering from cold-related illnesses. The elderly arrive with severe hypothermia. Young children develop pneumonia and bronchitis. Frostbite cases become common. The wards fill to capacity and beyond, with patients lying on floors and hallways. Medical staff work continuously, exhausted and overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses face impossible choices about which patients to prioritize. Some patients, particularly the very elderly and the very young, do not survive. Deaths become a daily occurrence in hospitals across the nation. Death tolls rise. People die from exposure while waiting for help. People die from hypothermia at home despite having fires. People die from medical complications exacerbated by the cold. The death rate increases dramatically compared to normal winters. Funeral parlors become overwhelmed. Cemeteries struggle to maintain their ability to bury the dead as the frozen ground becomes difficult to dig. The psychological impact becomes as severe as the physical. Families live in constant fear. Parents worry that their children will freeze. Children understand that they face genuine danger. The elderly know that survival is uncertain. The psychological toll of this extended crisis manifests in depression, anxiety, and despair. People begin to wonder if the winter will ever end or if they are living in a new permanent state of frozen desolation. Communications break down almost entirely. Phone lines remain down. Postal services cannot function. News from other regions becomes impossible to obtain. Families worry about relatives in other parts of the country with no way to contact them. The isolation intensifies the psychological strain. People feel cut off from the rest of the world, trapped in their frozen homes. The government struggles to respond. Military units are deployed to deliver supplies and provide assistance. However, even military vehicles struggle in the extreme conditions. Relief efforts are hampered by the very conditions they are trying to address. Supply shortages become critical. Food stores continue to dwindle. Heating fuel becomes nearly impossible to obtain. People begin rationing everything, surviving on minimal calories and minimal heat. As February progresses into March, the nation reaches a point of genuine desperation. The frost has now lasted nearly 3 months without interruption. This becomes the longest continuous frost period in over 200 years, since 1740. People's reserves of hope begin to fail. The question changes from, when will it end? To, will it ever end? Some begin to wonder if this represents a permanent change in climate, an ice age beginning. Families survive on meager rations. Children are undernourished and weakened by the cold. Elderly relatives face mortality. Working people lack the energy to function properly. The daily struggle for survival consumes all attention and energy. Maintaining fires becomes a constant preoccupation. Finding water becomes a complex task. Obtaining food dominates thoughts and actions. Keeping warm enough to survive through each night becomes the sole objective. Communities fragment under the stress. Some neighborhoods help each other, sharing supplies and resources. Other neighborhoods deteriorate into selfishness, with individuals and families hoarding supplies and turning inward. The social bonds that normally hold communities together strain under the pressure. Yet in many places, examples of remarkable kindness emerge as people sacrifice their own comfort to help neighbors in greater need. The infrastructure continues to deteriorate. Roads remain completely impassable. The railway system is essentially shut down. Airports cannot function. Ships cannot move through frozen ports. The nation is isolated internally, with regions cut off from each other. The economy essentially stops functioning. Factories close because workers cannot reach them and because fuel is insufficient to operate them. Businesses cannot conduct commerce because supply chains have failed. Medical services strain to the breaking point. Hospitals run out of supplies. Medicines are rationed. Some procedures cannot be performed because the necessary equipment or materials are unavailable. Infection rates increase because hygiene becomes difficult with water shortages. Some patients recover because of medical intervention, but others die because the systems designed to save them have become inadequate. Yet through all this suffering, the meteorological situation slowly begins to shift. The high-pressure system that has anchored the cold over Britain for nearly 3 months begins to weaken. Weather patterns start to change. The Meteorological Office notes the first signs that the extreme weather may be ending. The first hopeful news reaches the public. In early March, temperatures begin to rise incrementally. The change is slow at first, barely noticeable. A degree or two above zero. The snow begins to melt, first just a surface layer in places where the sun shines directly. Streams of meltwater run down gutters. The edges of frozen water in bowls and containers begin to show small amounts of liquid water. The news broadcasts bring the first genuine good news in months. The Meteorological Office announces that the cold system is breaking up. Relief broadcasts across the nation. People emerge from their homes slowly and carefully, having spent most of the past 3 months indoors. Many move stiffly, their bodies weakened by weeks of minimal food and extreme physical stress. Some people stand outside simply to feel the sun on their faces. The psychological impact of seeing the sky clearly, of feeling warmth returning, cannot be overstated. People cry with relief and gratitude. The supplies begin to flow again. Lorries move on roads that are becoming passable. Trains begin operating on partially cleared tracks. Shops receive deliveries for the first time in weeks. Shelves gradually fill with food and supplies. The feeling is almost surreal after months of shortages and rationing. People who had nearly forgotten what certain foods look like see them return to shelves. The nation begins the process of recovery. The water systems gradually thaw and begin functioning again. Heating fuel becomes available. Electricity becomes more reliable. The psychological state of the population begins to shift from survival mode to recovery mode. People assess the damage. Families account for who survived and who did not. Communities evaluate what they experienced and what it meant. The death toll becomes clear. Over 300 deaths are directly attributed to the winter. Hundreds more occur indirectly as complications from the cold, and hardship claim lives in the weeks and months following the winter's end. The nation recognizes that this was not just an inconvenience or a difficult season, but a genuine national tragedy that cost lives and changed people forever. Stories emerge of extraordinary human resilience and kindness. Tales circulate of neighbors who shared their last supplies with those in need. Stories are told of families who stayed together and survived through collective will. Examples of sacrifice and courage become part of the cultural narrative of the winter. Yet also stories emerge of hardship, loss, and suffering that will mark survivors for the rest of their lives. Spring arrives fully in April 1963. The landscape transforms from white to green. Grass grows. Flowers bloom. Birds return in abundance. The natural world comes back to life in a process that seems almost miraculous after months of frozen desolation. The sun shines warmly. The temperature reaches levels that feel comfortable and normal. Yet the winter of 1963 becomes permanently embedded in British consciousness and memory. Survivors carry the experience with them for the rest of their lives. For years afterward, people will reference the winter as a touchstone of hardship and endurance. Survivors will tell stories about their experiences to younger generations who cannot fully comprehend what it was like to live through such conditions. The winter of 1963 becomes part of the national identity. It represents a time when the modern nation faced a challenge beyond its infrastructure, beyond its comfort, beyond its normal capacities. The British people faced nature at its most severe and answered the challenge with a combination of resourcefulness, cooperation, and sheer determination to survive. Communities came together under pressure. Strangers became friends through shared hardship. Individuals discovered depths of courage and resilience they did not know they possessed. The experience transforms how people view their lives. Those who survived understand that comfort is not guaranteed. That services people depend on can fail. That survival requires adaptation and sacrifice. That community and human connection matter more than material possessions. That the natural world is more powerful than human technology and infrastructure. The winter of 1963 becomes a defining moment in 20th century British history. It is remembered as a test the nation passed, as a moment when everything was uncertain and the outcome was not guaranteed, but through collective effort and individual sacrifice, the British people endured. When people look back on their lives, many will identify this winter as a watershed moment, a time before and a time after. A time that changed them personally and changed the nation collectively. Decades later, survivors will still speak of the winter. Teachers will include it in history lessons. Writers will feature it in novels and memoirs. Documentary makers will film interviews with those who lived through it. The winter of 1963 becomes one of those historical events that defines a generation and remains part of the cultural memory of an entire nation. It represents human resilience in the face of natural forces beyond human control. It represents the strength that comes from community and mutual support. It represents a time when people discovered what they could endure and what they could survive. The winter of 1963 becomes the winter that Britain will never forget.